Thank you, Tracy, and good afternoon, good morning, everyone. I'd like to officially convene today's CFPB Academic Research Council meeting, or ARC. I'd like to welcome all ARC members as well as members of the public that are listening in today. Thank you all for making time today. My name is Manny Magnon. I serve as a staff director for the Advisory Board and Councils section here at the Bureau. Today, I'll be serving as a designated federal officer for this advisory committee meeting. As background, the CFPB established its advisory committees to provide substantive information, analysis, operational expertise, knowledge of their communities, and feedback to inform the Bureau's work. The ARC is comprised of economic experts and academics with diverse viewpoints. You can find a full list of the Bureau's advisory committees on our website at consumerfinance.gov. As a reminder, the views of the ARC members are their views. They are greatly appreciated and welcomed, yet they do not represent the views of the Bureau. Now I'd like to go over what you can expect during this engagement. Today's meeting will run from 1 p.m. and conclude at 3:15 p.m. Eastern. We'll start with remarks from the Bureau's Deputy Director, Sixta Martinez. Our first agenda item is a discussion of small business lending research. The second agenda item is on incorporating racial and economic equity analysis. Following each session, there will be time for Q&A and discussion with ARC members and Bureau staff. During this meeting, we'll have a 15-minute break. As a reminder to Bureau staff and ARC members, during the Q&A sessions, if you would like to make a comment, ask a question, or answer a question, please press the raise hand icon and research staff or the ARC chair, Vicky Bogan, will call on you. Before you speak, please be sure to unmute your lines and provide your name, title, and organization. Please be sure to mute your lines when you're not speaking. Please also put the raise hand feature down when you have finished speaking. Everyone should have received an email from my team with the meeting materials, including the agenda and the presentations. Please open those documents now so you may follow along with us. I am pleased to introduce Sixta Martinez, who was appointed as Deputy Director of the Bureau. Deputy Director Martinez joined the Bureau in 2010 to help lead the implementation team and has since served as Senior Advisor for Supervision, Enforcement, and Fair Lending, Associate Director for the External Affairs Division, and Assistant Director for the Office of Community Affairs. Deputy Director, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Manny, for the introduction. Welcome, everyone, to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's meeting of the Academic Research Council, or the ARC. First, a special thank you to our chair, Vicky Bogan, for her leadership of the ARC. Vicky, we greatly appreciate your time and expertise. I also want to thank all of you for being here today. Public service is a rewarding endeavor, and I recognize and thank you for your service to consumers through your contributions to the ARC. When Congress created the CFPB, it entrusted the Bureau with carefully monitoring financial markets to spot risks, ensure compliance with existing laws, educate consumers, and promote fairness and competition. As a consumer-centric regulator, research is a key part of meeting our statutory requirements. With that in mind, the ARC was created to help us utilize and develop the latest research and methods along with the models we need to understand the impacts of emerging risks to consumers. With your insights, the CFPB will be better positioned to improve the methods we use to develop analytical frameworks that inform rulemakings and help us pose questions to identify the root causes of challenges that consumers face. Looking to those challenges, I think we can all agree that today's economy looks very different than it did a year ago. The labor market is tight, as employers have added millions of new jobs. The Bureau's ongoing research has shown that consumer and household spending is reflective of pent-up demand and that the housing market is booming, with the median home price recently reaching $400,000 for the first time in history. The CFPB's research has also highlighted the unevenness of the current recovery. Millions of families continue to struggle to make their housing payments, and small businesses face significant challenges. As a result, we are at a critical crossroads for consumers and the American economy. Your perspectives as leading researchers in your field will play a vital role in helping the CFPB to monitor markets, spot risks, and help foster a full and equitable recovery. As part of our research efforts, just 2 weeks ago, the CFPB issued Section 1022 orders for big tech payment platforms to provide information about their products, plans, and practices. The orders were issued to Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, Square, and PayPal. The Bureau also announced it would study the practices of Chinese tech giants that offer payment services such as WeChat Pay and Alipay. These platforms are faster, cheaper, and quickly evolving. They are also network businesses and can gain tremendous scale and market power within a short period of time. That opens up consumers to significant risks and potentially undermines fair market competition. Our researchers, economists, and market specialists will play important roles in using the data we receive to better understand these services and practices and answer key questions, such as how might big tech use this data to deepen behavioral advertising, engage in price discrimination, or sell personal data to third parties? How might companies operate their payments platforms in a manner that interferes with fair, transparent, and competitive markets? How adequate are these platforms' plans to ensure adherence to key consumer protections? And how effectively do they manage complaints, disputes, and errors? This evaluation of big tech's payments platforms data will inform us about the future of our payment systems. It will also yield insights that might help the CFPB implement our statutory responsibilities, including any potential rulemaking under Section 1033 of the Dodd-Frank Act, which involves the disclosure of consumers' data by regulated entities. As we continue to exercise our authorities to determine the emerging risks posed by big tech's presence in the financial marketplace, the CFPB looks forward to working with you to ensure consumer protections are clear and robust. Looking to today's meeting, there are additionally equally important topics to discuss. First on the agenda is small business lending research. As you know, small businesses are the engines of growth in our economy, serving as key drivers of wealth creation and upward mobility. In fact, there are over 30 million small businesses in the US, employing nearly half of all private sector workers and generating over 60% of net new jobs. Small businesses are also a vital part of the fabric of our communities, giving character and identity to neighborhoods and serving local needs. Yet we don't know enough about whether small businesses have fair and equitable access to the credit they need. And when businesses can't access credit, that doesn't just hold them back. It holds back their employees, the communities they serve, and the American economy. We saw the risks that come with this amid the pandemic, with small businesses hit hard by the resulting financial shocks. 74% of small businesses reported losing revenue, and 200,000 more closed than in normal pre-pandemic times. In response, federal government implemented the Paycheck Protection program. But initially, we saw reports of the smallest businesses, many of those Black or Hispanic owned, struggling to access funds. reminding us of the importance of fair and equitable access to credit. Small businesses continue to face challenges to achieving a full recovery as new obstacles such as labor and supply shortages arise. This continued uncertainty presents difficulties for small businesses seeking access to much needed credit, since bank lending practices have historically been cautious during similar economic times. We see this uncertainty in the data, with the US Census Bureau finding that as of October 2021, almost 40% of small businesses expect another 6 months to pass before they can return to a more normal operating level. The CFPB has made learning more about small business lending a top priority. We recognize the vital role small businesses play in order for families and communities to thrive, particularly communities that have historically faced structural disadvantages in our economy. To better respond to future crises, as well as in the day-to-day, we need to know much more about the credit needs of small businesses. As part of that focus, on September 1, the CFPB published a notice of proposed rulemaking for Section 1071 of the Dodd-Frank Act, which, if finalized, would help the CFPB create a database of application-level small business lending data. Simultaneously, we launched a Share Your Story platform for small business entrepreneurs to share their experiences about applying for credit. The comments gathered through the NPRM and the Share Your Story effort will help us learn more about how we can help small businesses thrive. During today's session, representatives from the Office of Research will share more about our ongoing efforts to understand the effects of the pandemic on the use of small business credit. Then, the agenda will turn to discussing the CFPB's efforts to more fully incorporate racial and economic analysis into the Bureau's work. For example, the CFPB's Office of Consumer Response recently published a report on consumer complaint data that looks at complaints by census tract. Using this approach, we were able to make new connections between types of complaints we receive and the demographic characteristics of the communities they represent. There's even more work to do that is similar to this, a shift that is essential as part of our commitment to recentering equity in the CFPB's work. Most importantly, ensuring access to fair and affordable credit for low-income, minority, or traditionally underserved communities is at the core of our mission. And because of that, it is a top priority. We see this in our work to uphold and enforce fair lending, prevent housing discrimination, and ensure all consumers can access credit regardless of their race, national origin, sex, age, familial status, and other factors. The Office of Research will solicit your suggestions and advice for ways to integrate racial and economic equity analysis into the CFPB's research agenda. Finally, to close, I'd like to recenter our conversation on the people the CFPB serves. All families and consumers face challenges to achieving their American dream. The CFPB must be intentional about creating opportunities that fit the needs of specific communities, families, and individual consumers. I expect that today and in future meetings, all of you can help us develop ways to tear down structural barriers and create markets that are fair and competitive for everyone. Although I will need to leave at 1:30, staff will brief me and Director Chopra on the outcome of today's ARC meeting and apprise us of action items or questions that require a response. For now, I leave you in the capable hands of CFPB staff and again extend gratitude to you all for taking time from your daily work and family to provide your insights and feedback on these critical issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deputy Director. And with that, I'm going to pass the baton to the ARC Chair, Vicky Bogan.
So thank you, Deputy Director Martinez, and thank you, Manny. I'm pleased to be here today with all of you. I'd like to echo Manny Mignon and the Deputy Director's comments and welcome you all to today's meeting. At this time, I actually want to pause to thank Manny and all of his wonderful staff for putting together this meeting. I also have a special thanks to Crystal Dully for her help with my personal preparation, so thank you to your team. As Manny mentioned, we are joined by members of the Bureau's Academic Research Council, or the ARC, as we'll refer to the group. I serve as the chair of this committee, and it's a pleasure serving with all of the ARC members. I also would like to acknowledge Jason Brown, Assistant Director for the Office of Research, who's joining us today. It's been wonderful to be able to work with Jason and his quite dynamic team. The Academic Research Council advises the Bureau on its strategic research planning process and research agenda. Members also provide the Bureau, particularly the Office of Research, with technical advice and feedback on research methodologies, data collection strategies, and methods of analysis, including methodologies and strategies for quantifying the costs and benefits of regulatory actions. I've had the pleasure of participating in several engagements with research staff. For instance, I was delighted to have the opportunity to present my research related to household finance and mental health during a brown bag with the Office of Research. I also have had several discussions with research staff to help advise them on the Bureau's research agenda. I've appreciated the opportunity to work with fellow committee members and assist the Bureau in this process. Today is an opportunity for ARC members and the public to hear about the Bureau's research on small business lending and racial and economic equity analysis. And so with that, let's shift to our first agenda item on small business research lending. And for that discussion, we are going to be joined by Bureau subject matter experts from the Office of Research. They include Heath Whitson, economist from the Office of Research, and Claire Bernecki, economist from the Office of Research. And so now I will turn the virtual floor over to you, Heath and Claire.
Great, thank you, Vicki. And yes, as Vicki said, I'm Claire Bernecki. I'm an economist in the Office of Research. And Heath and I have both done a lot of work on the 1071 rule making. And so this is some additional research that is coming out of, sort of our interest in that. So we want to move to the next slide. So we always have to have our disclaimer that particularly because this is about research, this does not constitute any legal interpretation, guidance, or advice of the CFPB. Any opinions or views that Heath and I may share may not be are our own and may not represent the Bureau's views. Okay, so next slide. And we're really looking forward to the stories that we get out of that. So today, Heath and I are going to be talking to you about some recent work that we have done on small business lending, and then also some proposed future work that we're planning to do on small business credit card usage. So I'm going to start with the work that we've already done. So if we want to move to the next slide. So this is the Consumer Credit Trends report that we put out this summer, and hopefully you got that as a pre-read, so this won't be a shock to you. So what we were interested in for this report was that, a lot of times commercial and consumer credit are really intertwined for these small business owners. You often see that small personal credit scores are used to obtain commercial financing. And sometimes, that commercial credit is actually furnished to consumer credit bureaus. But prior to this report, we really didn't understand too much about how often that commercial credit was furnished and in what way. So on June 30th of this year, we released a consumer credit trends report called the Commercial Credit on Consumer Credit Report. And so what we did was we analyzed data from the Consumer Credit Panel, or the CCP, which for those of you that have been on the ARC or have been to these meetings before, you've heard a lot about this. So we used that to learn about what kinds of commercial credit were reported to consumer credit bureaus. And in general, we're also interested in sort of describing the types of credit trade lines and understanding a little bit more about those furnishing practices. And also, again, for those who attended last year, we also, sort of prepped you for this report by presenting about our plans for it last year. And so now you get to see how it turned out. So next slide. And so just a high-level overview. Again, you can, we encourage you to go and read the report. But what we found was that we estimated that in the average quarter, over 2.8 million consumers had a commercial credit product on their consumer credit report. And really that a lot of times what was being furnished was information about business credit cards. So this is by no means all small business owners, but it is still quite, a substantial number of consumers that were being affected by this. And so another finding that we have was that the number of furnishers, so the, institutions that are providing information to the consumer credit bureaus has decreased a lot over time, but that decrease has largely corresponded to an overall decrease in the number of banks. So banks are doing much of the reporting to consumer credit bureaus, and so as those numbers decline, then we also see an equivalent decline in furnishers. And we think that we found some pretty interesting, important furnishing strategies. So basically, what are the patterns with which furnishers provide information? So first, we find that a lot of institutions are clearly not furnishing any information at all. So comparing the number of banks that provided information to the number of banks total that have small business credit on their balance sheets, we find that about 89% of all banks did not furnish any commercial credit to consumer bureaus. We also find that often those that do furnish information only furnish some credit types. So while there's a lot of business credit cards, very few non-credit card lines of credit were being furnished. It's generally, again, business credit cards and business term loans. So that sort of use of credit will affect whether the credit is being furnished. And finally, we found that there were some furnishers that only furnished information when the account went delinquent. So some furnishers, you really only see, you never see any accounts that are in good standing, only accounts that are seriously delinquent, which could have a real impact on those consumers / small business owners. So that's that's just a quick summary of, what we found in our existing research. So I'm going to hand it over to Heath to talk about some exciting new research that we're hoping to undertake. Heath?
Thanks, Claire, and good afternoon, everyone. So on the next slide, please, what we're going to talk about, I'm going to transition from thinking about our past work in the small business lending space to discussing potential future research in this space. And in particular, that research is going to be on small business credit cards and also the interaction with the COVID-19 pandemic. So kind of starting out from kind of what we know, both Bureau and external researchers have studied consumer credit card trends and the effect of the pandemic on important outcomes. So there's several examples of that within the Bureau from our Bureau colleagues. So for example, in September, there was a consumer credit card market report that also detailed a lot of credit card market happenings that occurred during the pandemic. We've also had a long series of research reports and blog posts documenting consumer credit and including in that credit cards during the COVID-19 pandemic, which I would encourage everyone to go and check out. A lot of great work in those respects. And there's also been examples of external researchers by, for example, economists at the Fed Board analyzing credit card data. So for example, from internal research, we do know that consumer credit card balances declined significantly during 2020. That was a pretty broad trend. And if you cut across the data in a bunch of different ways, that was true for a lot of different segments. And then from external research, we do know that there seems to be this relationship between pandemic severity and credit card transactions. So in areas where that had were locally hit harder by the pandemic, you would see a relationship between that pandemic severity and credit card balances decreasing and credit card purchases decreasing. So our overall idea is to kind of carry some of those insights forward and use the Bureau's Y14 credit card data that I'll talk about on the next slide to study some important trends in the business credit card usage, both in the past and during the pandemic. One of the difficulties with studying the small business lending space is just a general lack of data. Even to the extent that we have data on the consumer markets, we have kind of correspondingly less data in the small business lending space. And so we're left with some surveys like the Small Business Credit Survey from the Fed, or we have the Census Small Business Pulse Survey, for example. But even kind of within the data that the Bureau has, we have documented in our previous report that there's small business trade lines on consumer credit reports. But we also, in that same report, provide some evidence why it would not be good to use the CCP data to study this particular market, because we know that its coverage is not complete and it's going to be dependent on a lot of different factors. And so what we'd like to do is use the Y14 data to add to our knowledge about how the pandemic affected businesses, particularly small businesses. And what we'd like to do is learn about how businesses' credit card spending might differ from consumer spending, particularly during recessions. So it could be that we find that small businesses act in the same way that consumers do in terms of their credit card spending, but we could find maybe different patterns because there were different, small businesses had kind of different experiences. There's also different types of interventions that were targeted towards small businesses. So it would be interesting to see if there were any differences, because that could maybe have implications for future interventions during recessions. So let's move on to the next slide, please. So we kind of think about this set of potential future research having kind of two forks that we can think about. And the first would be a Bureau anticipated output as a data point. So a longer Bureau report that's a little bit more descriptive in nature. And what we would do is we would use our Y14 credit card data that the Bureau has in-house. Now, if anybody's unfamiliar with that, that's loan level data on credit cards shared by the Federal Reserve Board. It's de-identified information that they collect as part of their Y14M data collection, and that's account level credit card information that can be, I think, really interesting and really useful in this context. And so what we could potentially use that data for is to broadly describe business credit card usage, both before and during the pandemic. We think relative to the consumer credit card market, there's less information about how, in particular, business credit cards are used. So first, it would be good for us to kind of describe what that market looks like and how things like balances, purchase volume, utilization, delinquencies, the rates at which accounts revolve exist in a pre-pandemic state, and then how all of those different data items change as a result of the pandemic. And so, for example, we could revisit the question of kind of, did business owners pay down balances on their credit cards during the pandemic? We saw that behavior with consumers. We can investigate, for example, whether or not that that behavior was also true of business owners. And then in the next slide, if we could advance to the next slide, please. Thank you. The other fork of this kind of research we would anticipate being a little bit more along the lines of an academic research report, for example, targeted more towards a journal article related to small business credit cards and their interaction with the Paycheck Protection program. And so we would want to focus on the effects of the pandemic on small business credit card usage and the interactions with the PPP program. Now, the PPP provided a 100% federally guaranteed low interest loans to small businesses. The amount of that loan the business could qualify for depended on their overall amount of payroll spending, and those loans could be forgiven if they were largely spent in qualifying categories of expenses. And we think that this is kind of a large intervention directed particularly at small businesses, and this might be an interesting setting in order to use our credit card data to look at the effects of that program. We're taking a little bit of inspiration from a recent working paper by several Fed Reserve economists on the consumer credit card market, and they use the Y14 data. And for example, one of the kind of key findings and methods from that report is to use measures of local pandemic severity to estimate the effect of COVID-19 cases on purchases, credit card purchases, utilization, and balances. And we think it would be very interesting to look at the same thing for small business credit card spending, which in the Y14 data, you can sort out small business cards from consumer cards to look at that. And then we would also like to go a little bit further and use a measure of local PPP dollars to estimate maybe the effect of PPP dollars on all these different credit card measures that I've been mentioning up to now, conditional on pandemic severity. And we think that there might be a window of doing that because previous studies have, and just the design of the program have shown that PPP uptake was only kind of loosely related to pandemic severity. So we kind of in designing this program kind of spent a lot of money on PPP and kind of lumped it at one time, and as opposed to there was a lot of variation in when there was severe, for example, the timing of the first wave and severe outbreaks of COVID-19. And so we think that it could be very interesting to use kind of the variation in when PPP dollars were issued and the measures of local pandemic severity and the timing of the first wave, for instance, to look at kind of the effect of PPP dollars on all of these different credit card measures. And so I think I'm going to now kind of transition over to having a broader discussion where we can talk about our discussion questions and all the research that we've presented so far. So if we want to go to the next slide. So we have overall discussion questions, but of course we're interested in any feedback on everything that we've presented so far, our past research, and generally broad reactions to the proposed research that I was just talking about. And we have some specific questions to facilitate that discussion as well, which I'd like to open up to our ARC members if they would like to kind of take the opportunity to provide some comments or questions. We could start out by focusing a little bit more narrowly on are there other measures of business credit card usage that you would find interesting to study in our planned research? And then also as a kind of sub-question, are there outcomes, patterns, or focuses specific to business cards that may differ from consumer cards, which you would find interesting to examine? And so kind of at this time, I'd like to open it to both Vicky and the rest of the ARC to feel free to jump in with questions or comments about the research we presented. I think I see Mike Statton's hands up.
Yes, thanks. I'd like to probe just a little bit. I find it very interesting the path that you're going down in terms of trying to relate severity of the pandemic to various measures of credit card usage. And I'm interested in what you're thinking in terms of the behavioral driver there. In other words, kind of what's the small business analog to this notion of consumers, many consumers having saved a lot during the pandemic simply because of the lockdown prevention of a lot of places they like to spend before. That's not certainly true for everybody, but certainly up the income scale. When you couldn't go to restaurants, you couldn't travel, you ended up not spending nearly as much. And we saw the consequent impact, I think, on credit card balances. So is there a small business analog to that? And is it tied to pandemic severity? What are your thoughts on that? I'm just curious.
I think that's a great question. And I think it's interesting because credit cards, particularly business credit cards, is like an entry level kind of credit product for small businesses. Might mean that, for example, business credit card users are somewhere in this region between kind of consumers and commercial. They exist in kind of that in-between gray space. So it would make sense to me that even some of the behaviors that you see in the consumer card space, because the business owner is, kind of in between in that space, might exhibit some of those same behaviors that you see in consumer cards, because they're they might be kind of using the same kind of income, reacting to the same kind of stimulus payments and things like that. But then what I think is also interesting is that you then might have some kind of competing forces in play with businesses as to, one, whether or not they were allowed to operate and function because of shutdowns and things like that. What happened to their overall kind of revenue stream? But then also you had these other sources of pandemic funding, such as the Paycheck Protection program. So it's kind of, the way that that worked was that in propping up businesses in that way, does that kind of act like a stimulus payment did for consumers? Do businesses exist the same? We also think that it would be interesting to look at kind of what was happening with the issuances of those PPP dollars relative to kind of when that business might have been impacted by some of the local pandemic conditions. So I think what makes the business credit card context particularly interesting is that you might have kind of a confluence of both maybe consumer behaviors as well as these pressures that small businesses faced independently of being consumers. And the predictions are tricky there because they could always go in, depending on the relative strength of those, could go in different directions.
Thank you.
Claire, I don't know if you had anything to add to that before I move on.
No, that was great. That was what I was thinking too.
Yes, so I see Anthony's hand up.
It's always Tony, but I know you got the label. I've got mainly two thoughts. One is just thinking about what's happened to home equity over the last few years and interest rates. It would be very smart for small businesses to consider switching their financing and basically doing a lot of cash out refinancing through their mortgage market. And of course, you have some geographically disaggregated data, and I wonder if some of that was going on. As a matter of fact, I wonder if some of that was going on with the consumer credit being paid down by households. If in fact there's been a boom in cash out refinancing, and I just wonder if that isn't going on also. So that's a first kind of idea. And the nice thing about that is you have geographic variation in government policy towards shutting down, in the severity of disease, and also in the rate of appreciation in housing prices. So you have a very, very rich experiment that's been performed where, the opportunity to do this change in financing has occurred, and as well as the regulatory environment and the severity of the disease. So I think, there's a lot of ideas there. I note the Fed people took advantage of geographic variation, but I think they only scratched the surface in what they were doing.
Yeah, those are great suggestions. So I think, so definitely we want to look at the geographic variation, and I think this is a really nice other way of thinking about how you might have PPP dollars coming in one direction to affect how small business owners might be using their credit cards, and then having this other way by using home equity and that kind of house price variation. I think that's right, that we could sort of be exploring a lot of these different dimensions. The other thing I'll say, because sometimes it's unclear exactly how it's going to work directly through to the credit cards in that particular project. But one of the things that we also kind of are thinking about is, could we use some of our measures from the CCP, finding the presence of a commercial product on the consumer credit card, use that as a proxy to say this is a small business owner, and then see how maybe if they actually did do the home equity, if they were doing a lot of refinancing and how that may have affected those particular products. So there might be an avenue there as well to see a more direct link, but I think you're right about the geographic variation. So that's a great idea, and we'll try to look into that. Thank you.
I think I saw Vicky's hand next, I believe.
Yes, hi. First of all, I'd like to say I really appreciated kind of the pre-read and the opportunity to look at your report. It was very nicely done, so thank you for that. And I had a couple of things that I wanted to mention. One of them I'll start with first because it links to one of Tony's comments. And as I thought about kind of small business lending and credit cards, home equity is actually another vehicle that small business owners use to finance their businesses. And there were some other pandemic-related programs that affected, there were forbearance programs that were part of pandemic relief. And I was wondering if you have data on or could look at kind of forbearance take-up rates for small business owners and look at how that influenced, how that was influenced by the pandemic. If you had those types of data, I think that would be interesting, and how it affected, their access to credit differentially. The other thing that I was kind of struck by in terms of your report were these real differences in furnishing patterns for credit information. And I don't know if you have these data, but I was wondering if you're able to identify any types of biases in furnishing patterns by type of small business owner. So are there any, gender differentials, racial differentials in furnishing information? Do you have those types of data?
Yeah, so I'll take that one. So again, I think with this idea of the home equity, so going back to your first question, the home equity and forbearance programs, I think we might be able to use, again, what I was talking about with Tony about the, the sort of proxy for small business owners in the CCP. And so maybe we could also see if there was more uptake in forbearance, and we can talk more with our colleagues that have done more on that forbearance side. So that's really interesting. And then, again, with going back to this, it would be, again, the same sort of thing with the CCP to try to figure out a little bit more about if there's any bias there. So, so right now we don't have demographic information for individual consumers in the CCP, the de-identified consumers, but we are working on getting proxy information for those individuals. So I think at that point, then we'd probably want to go back and look at whether, different, Black and white small business owners are experiencing different furnishing rates. One thing we could try to see right now is based on the neighborhood that that consumer lives in. So that's something that we use in a lot of our work with the CCP, is saying, well, what is the demographic makeup of that tract that the consumer lives in, and use that as a sort of somewhat stand-in for race right now. So we can look and see if there are differences there in furnishing. I think it's a little tricky because sometimes we won't know, if someone is doing well and they're just, they keep paying off their loans and all that kind of stuff, and they're not going to appear in the data. But that's definitely something we can think more carefully about how we could do that, because I agree that would be really interesting. So thank you.
I see Matthew's hand up.
Yeah, hi, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. It's really interesting for a number of reasons. One just general question I had in terms of the data on credit reporting is this distinction between sole proprietorships and limited liability corporations. Can you speak to that distinction? Because my limited understanding is, of course, with an LLC, your personal assets are shielded from liability.
Yes. So one of the difficulty, even if we can kind of identify someone, for example, in our report in the CCP, if we can identify this de-identified, or not, if we're identifying a consumer, but if we can identify a business trade line attached to a consumer, is that we know very little about kind of anything to do about the potential business that could, could have resulted in that business trade line. We typically think about these, why these products might appear on a consumer credit report being tied into kind of possible personal guarantees associated with the credit product, which could still exist even if you had a limited liability corporation, because you could still have a personal guarantee attached to, Heath Whitson says he is going to repay this loan, even if that loan was made to Heath Whitson Incorporated or Heath Whitson LLC. But unfortunately, is that we can only kind of make some very, very weak kind of inferences about how that relationship exists, because we just don't know much about the business associated with that consumer in the CCP. We've explored commercial credit data, because of course there are commercial credit reporting bureaus, just like there are consumer ones, which will have more information about the potential businesses, but those data also come with their own sets of challenges and things like that.
Okay, thank you. That makes sense. So the other question I had, maybe comment, this is more of a question, is there any way to get a read on, you've mentioned PPP loans, and of course those gave nice liquidity bumps during tough times for a lot of small businesses. Do you have any read on PPP loan forgiveness, so downstream removing that liability, and how that may affect credit?
That's a great question. To the extent I know, we have data, at least from the SBA, on kind of the originations of those loans right now. I would have to look into further kind of what data will eventually be produced about the kind of the forgiveness aspect of those loans. I'm not quite as familiar with the forgiveness side of that transaction, but I agree that would be kind of interesting, and kind of learning about when that kind of liability for that is being lifted.
Yeah, and I think in particular, like Heath, you mentioned earlier, it was a pandemic, but it was also a recession, and so for future recessions, for policy mechanisms like PPP, okay, yeah, we get capital out there, but then to what degree was there variation in actually seeking and getting that forgiveness, and how does that affect businesses during a recovery period?
And one way that I'm trying to think about, how it's very tough in this context to sort out the pandemic specific parts of the recession, because it's kind of not the usual recession, or at least not typical of recessions that we've seen quite recently. But that's one reason why I'm kind of interested in this timing of kind of pandemic severity, or what your local pandemic severity is related to when you might have received the PPP loan, because there might be some areas, for example, particularly in kind of the Southeast, whose first wave happened much later, but did possibly receive PPP loans at an earlier time. So you could kind of think about that as maybe mimicking kind of more just, there's at least an initial kind of recession pressure on in those areas, kind of not associated with like the local pandemic severity. So it's kind of not great, but trying to tease out the recession component versus like the pandemic component. I see Mike's hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Heath. I want to follow up on the actual analysis of the business credit cards that you do have, and I'm just curious about whether you tried to take a deep dive at all. And I apologize if this is in a longer report and I just haven't seen it. But did you take a deep dive into whether there were any signs of binding liquidity constraints? Maybe trying to look at percent utilization on the cards. Were cards maxed out with some consistency, with some frequency? Did that tie into local lockdown conditions or anything of that sort? In other words, getting at the actual data that you do have on those business credit cards to see if there was a binding constraint.
I think that we could. So I think to some extent that we should be able to see relevant measures of that in kind of as the proposed research. So not kind of research that we've done so far, but kind of as proposed research using that Y14 credit card data, because you will definitely know rates of utilization, what the balances look like, or what the credit limits are for those cards, and kind of how how close they are, and then any kind of measures of delinquency are also in there. So no to have we looked at that so far, but that can definitely be incorporated as a measure of what we would hope to look at in kind of a future report using this data. It would also be interesting to some point revisit what we also see in the CCP, what we were analyzing for our kind of initial report on consumer credit, and see kind of what we could learn about behaviors there. But that's a little bit more fraught because we're kind of in that report, we're kind of documenting that there's a lot of kind of selection into who's furnishing this data, and kind of what trade lines do actually end up there. But I think in the Y14 credit card data that we're proposing to use, you would see a lot of those things.
Yeah, and I'll just add there one thing that's a little bit of a challenge is, like, we can see individual credit cards in the Y14, but we wouldn't be able to say, oh, these 3 credit cards correspond to the same business owner. Something that we could, that kind of thing we can see in the CCP, because it's, one consumer's records are all linked together, but that's not the case in the Y14. So it'd be a little hard we can't do any sort of like switching or seeing like, oh, this person is like completely maxed out on everything, but we could see the way that those, if you find that folks are, that the business cards were meeting their limits at some points, or they were being eased at some point. So again, not at like a full portfolio level, but we could see individuals. So I think that would still be pretty interesting.
And the last thing I would mention there is I do also believe that you could see new card issuances. So you could see new card accounts as well, and that could also get a kind of a similar measure of kind of to what extent new non-PPP credit, like new credit cards were being issued during that time, which also ties into that question, I think. I think I saw Tony's hand next.
Okay, well, I got 2 points. One, both of which are sort of generally academic, but one, there's a paper, working paper from this summer, July 2021, by Enrico Moretti and Rebecca Diamond, and they have a very imaginative use of credit card data to make inferences about what's going on in terms of consumption in individuals. And there might be some tricks in that paper that you would find handy. And and you could just contact the authors, and they might know some other tricks, whatever. Or their research assistants probably actually know the tricks. At Stanford and Berkeley, it is what it is. Anyway, so that's my first point and suggestion. I got a second, and this, okay, so this is, wild-eyed academic, I suppose. I enjoyed your September report to Congress. I thought there was a lot of information in there. But, when you're doing those reports, you're kind of comparing what's happened recently to what's happened in the past. And that's useful. But another thing that's often useful is to kind of develop a model of credit use. And then you have 3 comparisons. You have what we've done in the past, we've got the forecast from the model, and we've got the actual. And there's a lot of information in trying to forecast and failing, and then trying to attribute the failure to something. And so I know that it takes a lot of time and everything like that, but obviously that, there would nothing, I mean, if you guys want to get the director, on who's the bald-headed guy who smashes around a lot on TV and makes wild stock predictions? This is public. I shouldn't have said that. Well, anyway, that guy's program, you say, oh, well, here's what we're predicting for credit card use, and here's what it was actually, and we think that the differences are all coming from New Jersey, and that could be pretty neat, and also I think would get a lot of attention to your work. So anyway, that's my wild idea, and I apologize to that TV host who I mentioned.
I think those are interesting set of set of ideas. So first, thank you for the paper recommendations. That does sound like kind of learning tricks from that data. I'm assuming that I believe that we'd have kind of the kind of the data resources here to be able to kind of implement some of those in this particular data set. So I appreciate that. That is really interesting about the idea of thinking about models and maybe regular reporting of a model and kind of how well we can kind of use the past data to predict. I do think that would be kind of it would have to be kind of a broader OR effort in that respect, because that does sound kind of like in terms of kind of the research we propose versus kind of that undertaking would be kind of larger in scale. Claire, I don't know if I jumped in before you there. If you have any thoughts about that as well.
No, that's what I was going to say too. So.
And I thought I saw Vicky's hand up, but I guess she must have put it down.
Yeah, I actually put it down, one, because I was going to mention the diamond paper. Tony mentioned. And also, I guess another kind of follow-up question to something that Mike had asked earlier, in terms of trying to understand if there are binding constraints in business credit card markets. You mentioned that you have new application information. Do you have denials? Do you have any measure of, how many business owners get denied access to a business credit card?
So unfortunately, we don't have applications in the data that we have now. So once 1071 is up and running, we will, but unfortunately not in the Y14 as far as I'm aware. There are some things that we could do with some of the in-house data, but I think we'd have to be really thoughtful about how to use that, and I think it wouldn't be very broad. So unfortunately, I think that is going to be a challenge for us in terms of looking at acceptance. But we can look at new originations of cards. Yeah.
Thank you.
Got to get that 1071. Yeah.
And kind of more generally, because I don't see hands up at the moment, so we could also feel free to broaden kind of our discussion. And we've had some now, for example, on home equity lines of credit, but kind of thinking broader beyond the business credit card space. There's also, I think we'd have time to venture further into the small business lending space. And if anyone has additional kind of ideas about projects or area directions that we should maybe head in as a research unit, be happy to explore that as well. Oh, and also on this slide, one question that I did skip over is we've been kind of talking a lot about what's been going on in the past, what happened during 2020 and 2021, what happened during the pandemic. But we also had a question here, kind of thinking a little bit going forward, kind of what patterns, what factors or patterns in small business cards might be very interesting to monitor kind of as the economy is recovering and continuing to recover. Because, learning both kind of from historical data and then also performing kind of like a monitoring function of what would be good to keep track of going forward, we think both of those things could be interesting.
Yeah, since there seems to be a little time, one of the things that I kind of find interesting about business credit cards versus consumer credit cards is sort of the differing use of rewards. And so the rewards for credit cards seem to be a big thing. And when you look at some of the, financial institution, marketing, they are always marketing kind of these rewards that are specific and unique areas, unique aspect of the business credit cards. Have you looked at all at any of that? It just seems like a big black box to me. And I was wondering if you have information on that, or if you looked at kind of reward usage for the small business credit cards.
Yeah, so we haven't yet, but I'm pretty sure that we can. So I'm pretty sure there's some information in the data, and of course I'll check with our research assistant who knows all the details after this. And so I think that would be something that we could look at, and I think that would be really interesting. And there might also be some opportunity with some other data sets, thinking about that I'm not sure if we currently have, but we can maybe expand, because I know that we have other data on credit card sort of offers that go out. And that's usually, I think we primarily have it on consumer cards, but it could be something that we look into, sort of procuring maybe the business side, and if they had some of that, like in terms of the rewards. But I'm pretty sure that we would be able to do that in the Y14, and look into whether or not there are other papers that have done that, and so we can kind of piggyback off of those. So I don't really have a good sense of what kinds of rewards are on business cards right now, and so I think that would be pretty interesting.
Thanks.
I know that at least in that data on card offers and marketing, some business products do appear, but I think it's a question of kind of to what extent the N is large enough for us to be able to kind of analyze those with any kind of granularity. We might be running into kind of a similar problem in the CCP in that, kind of this is a very small selected portion of certain types of offers.
Sure, it's been a black box to me. I was just interested. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. And I see, Mike, you have your hand up as well.
Yeah, kind of jumping in on the same theme, I'm curious to learn more about what you guys have learned from your exploration of small business credit in general. How much of the universe of credit that's available to small businesses do you think you're missing? Or let's say, do you think is outside the credit card world and the home equity lines that we've already addressed? And one of the reasons I ask that is I'm just curious as to why there hasn't been a more comprehensive reporting network that's evolved for loans outside of those two categories. And one answer may be that there just aren't that many. But what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm going to start because I wrote my dissertation on the first credit reporting agency that started in the 1840s. And so it was really, that was how credit reporting started, was to look at small businesses, essentially. More of the economy was occupied by small businesses at that time. But that's where it was, handwritten reports saying, this guy is good, he has good credit, you should lend to him. And then it evolved into rating, and then you see Moody's and S&P, and you see the development of consumer credit. But I think it's a really interesting and big question that I have about why it isn't more developed now, right? So we have the small business financial exchange. We have things like Dun & Bradstreet. So actually the company that I studied became Dun & Bradstreet eventually. And so there's things that they do cover, but it's definitely not as extensive. And so I think this is a really interesting question as to why this market hasn't really developed that much, or it hasn't been as extensive, because, you're right that we see credit cards, we do see a little bit in the consumer reports, but for the most part, we haven't been able to find those data that have like a really comprehensive view of what a small business, what kind of debt they're taking on, what kind of credit they use. Even when we talked to different, to different parties that should be providing that kind of information, or other researchers who have tried to find that information, everybody sort of agrees it's just not there, right? And so, 1071, this attempt to get all of these applications and have something like HMDA, but for small business lending, that will really fill a big hole. But there's still a lot that's that it won't be monitoring, it won't be going forward. And so, that is something that I think is a really great question that, I think I would love to study that, about why this information market doesn't work the way that you think it should, and that it's tried for over a century to try to get at that, but we really haven't been able to. But it is correct that we are finding, we're using these, essentially regulatory data. That's what the Y14 is regulatory data to get an insight into this market, and that will give us a really nice, clean picture of a very large part of the business credit card market, but we don't have that for other things. And, to your point about the home equity loans, that's something that we also, so home equity loans, and then also consumer credit cards, and how small business owners use their actual consumer products to fund their businesses. And that's another thing that we don't have insight into. We sort of sit and think every once in a while about how we could possibly use the CCP in that way, but we haven't come up with anything. And so I think that would be extremely interesting and helpful to know how small business owners use their consumer products in that way. But so far we've yet to find that. So I don't know if he's had.
It just strikes me that it might be the case that we're actually seeing the majority of it. We can't necessarily attribute it, and we can't aggregate it in the same consumer necessarily, that it's actual financing small business, but we might be seeing most of it, but just because that's the most convenient tool to use.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I do think that when we see the surveys from, out of the Fed system, so the Small Business Credit Survey, it's and surveys that they've had in the past, it seems like credit cards are one of the most commonly used products, and it kind of depends, especially the age and the if you have employees or not, if you're a non-employer firm. So there is some variation, and so business credit cards are up there, but there's still a lot of use of term loans and lines of credit, and that is something that we can see from our exam work, the fair lending exams and for small business loans. So you do see that there's an extensive amount, but it is difficult to understand the patterns there. If that makes sense, yeah.
And also there are segments that are hard to size, which we've encountered in our 1071 regulatory work as well, kind of, especially if financing by non-depositories is kind of an area where we only kind of know murky estimates of what the size of that market could be, but they're not subject to the same kind of reporting requirements as that of financial institutions, where we at least have some idea about the overall commercial and industrial lending that they have, even if it's kind of not the data that we would want for kind of the purposes of the research that we're talking about right now, where we can look at kind of individual accounts, but at least we kind of know the size of some of those aspects of the market. And I know we're kind of drawing down here to very close to the end of our time, with I think 3 minutes remaining, but I wanted to let us have a chance for kind of any last thoughts from any participants if we didn't get a chance to answer your question earlier. Okay. Vicky, I might go ahead and pass it back to you if you don't mind.
Well, first I want to say thank you to everyone. This was really great feedback, and I think that you guys have given us a lot of great ideas to go back and look into. Papers to look at, but also different ideas to look at. So thank you for such a productive conversation. This was great.
Thanks,
and
everyone.
Thank you, Vicky.
Thank you, Claire and Heath, for a really wonderful presentation. And I really wanted to thank all the ARC members and everyone for a very interesting discussion. I think we're now at time, and we can take a 15-minute break and reconvene at 2:30 Eastern Time for the discussion on incorporating racial and economic equity analysis. Okay, so welcome back, everyone. Thanks for coming back on a Friday afternoon. Without further ado, I'd like us to shift to our next agenda item, which is incorporating racial and economic equity analysis. For this session, we're joined by Bureau subject matter experts from the Office of Research. They include Eric Durbin, Section Chief for the Consumer and Household Research and Policy of the Office of Research, and Octavian Carrare, Supervisory Economist, Office of Research. And so now I will turn the virtual floor over to you, Eric, and you, Tavi. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Vicki. I'll start us off and then hand it over to Tavi. And thanks everybody for joining us for what I hope will be a really useful discussion of incorporating racial and economic equity impacts into thinking about our rulemaking here at the Bureau. So one of the things that we do in the Office of Research is what we describe as impact analyses. Often we think principally about cost-benefit analysis. There are certain other analyses that we have to do under statute of rulemakings, such as looking at impacts on small businesses. One thing that we've been thinking a lot about lately is how to incorporate an analysis of racial and economic equity impacts into thinking about our rulemakings. If we can go to the next slide here. So we've included a quote here from an executive order that was issued by the Biden administration early this year. I'll just read from it here. So the executive order strongly encourages independent agencies like ours to assess whether and to what extent its programs and policies perpetuate systemic barriers to opportunities and benefits for people of color and other underserved groups. Such assessments will better equip agencies to develop policies and programs that deliver resources and benefits equitably to all. So really see this as a call to action to try and think more carefully and systematically about how the rules that we issue here at the Bureau affect different groups. If we go to the next slide, this is a list of some of the discussion topics, and there's some overlap among these questions, but we thought this was a good set of prompts for discussion here as to how we should go about this work of trying to understand racial and economic equity impacts of the policies that we consider here at the Bureau. So we'll be asking you for ideas on how data that's currently available to the Bureau, HMDA data, which includes race and other demographic variables. Our consumer credit panel supplemented. We're looking at ways to supplement with proxies for race. How we can use those types of existing data to understand racial and economic equity impacts. What other data sources might we use or might we collect that would inform us about what we'll call RE impacts of our rulemakings. Ideas on how to analyze trade-offs or policy choices that might impact racial and economic equity, where there might be differences across the different policy choices we make in terms of how it affects particular groups as opposed to how does it affect average welfare overall. Idea of data methods, sort of methodologies we can use to try and identify these impacts. Maybe more specifically, ideas on how we could do effective lab or field work in the space. And ideas on the best way to integrate RE analysis in the context of our general economic analysis of rulemaking impact. So how should this be folded into the types of cost-benefit analysis, for example, that we're currently doing? The next slide, I think we have a specific example of a recent rule that I think might be helpful in terms of thinking more concretely as to how these considerations might fold into the policy work we do. The Bureau recently issued a mortgage servicing rule, which was specifically targeted at the pandemic. There's a large number of households now who are behind on their mortgage. A lot of people have been in forbearance programs and not making their monthly mortgage payments. Those forbearance programs are coming to an end soon, and we issued a temporary rule providing extra protections for people during this time to try and ensure that mortgage servicers are fully considering them for loss mitigation options, for essentially for modifications to their mortgage or other ways of avoiding foreclosure as we try and recover and come out of the pandemic period. And in that rule, we said specifically that that the borrowers who are currently in forbearance or behind on their mortgages are disproportionately Black and Hispanic. Black and Hispanic borrowers are also disproportionately likely to have less equity in their homes. And said that considering benefits to those groups was important to us in issuing this rule. So we said Black and Hispanic borrowers in the communities in which they live are especially likely to benefit from this rule. Homeownership plays a primary role in wealth creation in the United States, and a wave of foreclosures due to the current crisis may have a lasting impact on these borrowers' ability to maintain and accumulate wealth. So in making those statements in the rule, and we cited to some research that we've done here at the Bureau, we cited to research that folks had done outside of the Bureau to explain why we're seeing those different impacts and maybe greater benefits for these groups from our rule. And I think as we're going forward, we want to find a way to kind of more systematically ask these questions. How are the rules that we're considering, how different choices we might be considering in policy affect disadvantaged groups in different ways. We can go to the next slide, and I think I'll hand it over to Tavi now.
Thank you, Eric. So as a data-driven agency, rulemaking that's informed by data is very valuable to us. And as a result, analysis of REE impacts in rulemakings based on data is something that we would very much like to do. And in some policy spaces, as Eric hinted before, like mortgages and consumer credit, we may have in-house good quality data that can inform some of our rulemakings. In that space, however, those of us who work with data know that it's almost always true that good quality data is either costly or it takes a long time to acquire or both. So one of the questions that we would like to ask the members of the Academic Research Council is whether they're aware of any sources of data, preferably readily available, that we can consider to help us shed light on the impact of our rulemakings on racial and economic equity. And we are fully aware that sometimes, as rulemakings are time constrained, often analysis based on findings of existing literature and application of first principles from economics and other social sciences may be helpful when data are unavailable. One of the questions to the ARC members is what strengths and what limitations this approach may have. Next slide, please. And a further area of discussion may be related to the trade-offs that specific consideration of racial and economic equity may present policymakers. Just as an example, a policy that addresses a market failure that doesn't specifically address racial or economic equity may result in a greater total welfare improvement than a policy that aims to correct the same market failure, but which at the same time aims to improve racial and economic equity. And this is, very much a partial equilibrium view of maybe a more constrained policy choice. But maybe the more important question to the ARC members is whether consideration of racial and economic equity may increase welfare over lengthier. That's dynamic general. Next slide, please. One question that we thought we could discuss, and this is maybe a trickier one, but we hope that this is going to stimulate some discussion, is an approach based on evaluating potential racial and economic equity impacts using historical data appropriate, or to what extent such an approach is appropriate, especially when what we envision is a situation where rulemaking changes the historical perspective, and as a result of that, data may not be fully informative. Maybe the question that arises from that is, what are some fundamental exogenous or maybe policy invariant factors that can help evaluate the economic effects of specifically addressing racial economic equity. Next slide, please. So I should mention that we have in OR ongoing work that's foundational related to the understanding of racial and economic equity impacts, and we certainly aim to improve our understanding of the baseline differences by collecting and analyzing data that may help us understand these differences. So, for example, one of the current efforts in OR is adding race and ethnicity proxies to the consumer credit panel, which will certainly allow types of analyses that haven't been possible before. Expanding the sample sizes of surveys conducted off the CCP to generate more robust statistical findings by race and ethnicity. This is something that we've been pursuing in OR for some time now. Potentially increasing the sample size and also oversampling for the populations of interest in lab studies to be able to detect differences by race or by economic status, as well as recent descriptive reports on the experiences of different racial groups, in particular consumer credit markets. Next slide, please. This is inspired by our colleague Melissa, who leads the disclosures group. It's a battery of questions related to doing effective lab or field work in the RE research space. Clearly, disclosures are an important part of bureau policy. How can RE considerations be incorporated into testing the effectiveness of disclosures? What are the potential benefits and risks to collecting RE data in lab studies? Is one study enough to give enough credibility to our findings? We require more studies. Is that better? What research questions do we focus in testing? So maybe potentially distinctions between conducting the study about RE or discrimination on one hand, or collecting RE data to identify differences by race. How can we select subject pools that give us enough statistical power for findings? Should we consider batteries of questions to identify effects related to correlates of race? How can field studies support the Bureau's RE work? Are there examples that we should be aware of? These are just a few questions that arise in the context of lab and field work that's related to RE. Next slide, please. So to remind everybody, just almost on the 15-minute mark, some of the things that we seek guidance on are ideas on how data that's currently available to us can inform our analysis of the impact of rulemakings with respect to racial and economic equity, ideas on collecting informative data about RE impacts in rulemakings, and we're looking for potentially prospective and retrospective data and analyses. Ideas on how to analyze the potential trade-offs involved in specifically addressing racial and economic equity in our rulemakings, ideas on lab work, ideas on what is the best way to integrate RE analysis in the context of our more general economic analysis of the rulemakings impacts, benefit analysis, and regulatory possibility analysis. So with that, I think maybe we can open the discussion and see if we have any answers to some of these questions or hints.
I believe Mike tried to say something and his camera came up, but Mike, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I'll just jump in here. I mean, this is an enormously broad set of questions and challenge that you guys face, and I recognize that. I'm not sure in particular that I'm capable of even advising you on high-level guidelines that will apply in all cases. What I try and do is I've been thinking about these issues over the last 10 years, and especially as attention has increasingly focused on gaps in economic opportunity, is sort of go back to what I consider to be first principles. And that is, am I viewing this through the lens of equal opportunity, or am I viewing it through the lens of equal outcomes? And I think that's foundational in the way that we think about things. And I'm not saying you have to do one or the other, but I'm saying that it does take you down a different path. And if you go down that path, then you start focusing on particular rules and rulemaking from the standpoint of, are we addressing disparate treatment, say in lending, let's put it in a concrete context, or disparate impact? The disparate treatment cases are often pretty clear cut. And I think the system in large part in this country has dealt with that to a large degree pretty well over the last 20, 30 years to try and stamp out some of the more egregious examples. Disparate impact is a completely different issue, full of subtleties. And that's where your data is going to come into play. And so, if we think about proxies, and this seems, for me, in my area of expertise, this comes up most frequently in the context of lending, where lenders are constantly trying to assess, character, capacity, all of those fundamentals of whether somebody's going to repay a loan. And many of those things are unobservable. And so they end up seizing on observable proxies. And some of those proxies work pretty well, and some of them sort of work, but also are not exactly on the mark. And so, we're all familiar with using address of residence as a proxy. which led to redlining, which clearly had it may have had some statistical validity at the time, but it ends up having enormous disparate impact that almost everybody considers unfair. Or you fast forward in the lending profession, and it's not that long ago that credit scoring companies were telling you that the presence of a consumer finance loan in your credit report was a negative factor. And that, may have had some statistical relevance, but it's pretty clear that that's using a proxy that is not entirely accurate for that individual, and that there are better proxies available. And my sense is that has, I'm not sure, but I think that's declined in importance in the role in credit scoring models. So this is what I'm getting at. If you think about the rules that you make along those lines, I think it gives you some guidance as to what kind of data you need to collect to be able to make sure you're making the right call. I'll stop there.
Sorry, I was taking notes. Thank you so much for those thoughts.
I see Vicky's hand up. Happy to call on her if that's what I get to do.
No, I just had a few initial thoughts on some of your questions. One is kind of connected to some of Mike's comments in terms of talking about your proxies for race. Could you unpack that a little bit? I was just curious about, you said you're going to supplement the CCP with race proxies. And so I was a little curious about that. And the other thing that I wanted to ask, I wasn't clear on, are you already oversampling this population, or are you planning to? Or is that something that's, on the table to do that?
So I can answer the question about proxies, sort of a high level view based on things that we observe in the CCP data. The proxies are Bayesian measures, probability measures of being of a certain race or ethnicity.
Okay.
So these are informed by things like names and addresses and things like that. As for whether in the current one of the CCP, there's already oversampling, I think this is something that if we haven't done, we're considering. That's what I know, but there may be others who know this better.
Yeah, I think with the CCP is a random sample of folks with credit reports and doesn't oversample in any way. But when we do surveys, for example, off of the CCP, we oversample on multiple dimensions and oversampling on race or ethnicity. Well, if we had access to proxies for race and ethnicity, then that would give us an opportunity to oversample on race and ethnicity. As it stands, we do have census tracts, so that's something we could use, for example. I just, when we do disclosure testing, for example, which is typically qualitative testing, where we'll maybe interview a relatively small number of people, often we'll have a set of criteria that we would use to try and identify people, and that could include race and ethnicity. I'm not sure we've done that in the past. We've often focused on things like income or other factors that might speak to how someone might use the disclosure. But that's one question, I guess, for the panelists, for the council, is in doing that sort of testing, what might be good ways to make sure that we're picking up differences, for example, in race and ethnicity, in terms of how people would respond to a disclosure.
And how, my understanding is that the Survey of Consumer Finance is going to start oversampling minority populations soon. Would that be a data set that would be useful for some of your analysis?
Certainly, depending on the context of the policy that we're looking at, I would think that the Survey of Consumer Finances is a resource that we would certainly think about in many contexts here. So to the extent that they're doing a better job of identifying or collecting richer data on.
Yeah, I think they're just starting.
Right.
They're
So that will be
way
helpful to us. So.
to do oversampling for minority populations. So that might be helpful.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, I see more hands up. I will, and at the top of my list is Tony.
Yes, just a couple of thoughts. First, when you think about disclosure, I mean, I can see the idea of translating something into a different language, but the idea that you would hand someone a different disclosure form based on their race, I mean, I think you need to think about that, okay, as a as a practice. The same way, you could have credit scoring schemes that were different for different, ethnic groups or what have you. I mean, you could do that. I think that might be regarded as really problematic and hard to explain to people. So I would really think about what you're doing before you kind of go down that path. Another point I will make is that, and by the way, that relates to Mike's point about disparate impact. The answer is, yeah, you can basically say something like, okay, you again have to have a different credit scoring scheme for different groups, or you could just say, hey, you can only use one or two variables. Either way, those effects are going to be probably pretty negative. I mean, overall, there is a concern with the market being efficient. And we tend to believe that people benefit when the market is efficient. And so I think you need to keep that in mind. Another area is that, honestly, I find in the credit area that regardless of things like ethnicity or whatever, it's difficult to get the argument correct, period. I mean, to actually get the economics correct. I mean, for example, optimal forbearance for anybody is a terrifically complex problem. If you really want to work at it, it's really complex. And particularly, to forbear for someone who has a lot of negative equity is not doing them a favor. So that's a complex problem. I'll give you another example of something that where we got it completely wrong, and that's foreclosure externalities. There's this whole literature about foreclosure externalities says, oh, foreclosure is terrible for the neighborhood. And that's based on the fact that they didn't worry about foreclosure eliminating serious delinquency. It turns out serious delinquency is actually worse for the neighborhood than foreclosure. So foreclosure is actually the cure rather than the disease. Okay, there's a recent paper on this. You can look it up. It's actually by me. But in any event, the point is that the whole foreclosure discussion and neighborhood quality is completely backwards. So here's the problem, that I think the first thing to do is get the economics correct. And then second, you can worry about other stuff. But generally speaking, when you get the market to work efficiently, everybody will benefit in the long run. If the market does not work efficiently, everyone will be worse off. Okay, and include, by the way, they'll simply lie about their characteristics, right? I mean, if you think that, if people think that a lender will give them an advantage for being a member of a particular group, they'll just tell the lender they're a member of that group. And so all you've done is just had, massive falsification in the credit scheme. So that doesn't do anybody any good. So anyway, I think about promoting efficiency with the idea that people benefit from that. Okay.
Thanks very much. And just to sort of clarify one point there on disclosure testing, I think that the thing we've thought about more than providing different disclosures to people of different racial and ethnic groups is rather trying to understand more about whether disclosures are understood or used differently across different racial or ethnic groups.
Oh, I agree. By the way, I advised HUD years ago when they were working with different disclosure statements. And once you get beyond 3 numbers, forget it. You totally confuse. But you totally confuse almost everybody equally. And yeah, if you have economists design disclosure statements, it's going to be a disaster because we'll put in 8 numbers, right? And we'll even put in duration. And yeah, so you need to experiment with that, absolutely. And it is a fascinating area. But again, what we found was after you get, 3 numbers, the 4th number results in the people confusing the first 3.
It is a fascinating area, and I think we do a lot of testing, which I think really helps get us probably far away from what an economist would expect and want to see in their disclosures, to something that the population finds more useful. All right, Matthew's had his hand up for a while, so.
Yeah, thank you. I think, first of all, I really appreciate this conversation, appreciate CFPB bringing this before the ARC. I want to go back to a point that Mike made earlier, because I had a similar reaction that racial and economic equity it's a meta construct. I mean, there's a lot packed into it, historically and otherwise. I think before getting into data and methods, that perhaps 2 things could be considered. One is to consult with scholars, especially scholars of color, who have done various studies of racial and economic equity, to understand the different ways in which REE is conceptualized, operationalized, and analyzed, and particularly with respect to credit data and HMDA. And then the second consideration, perhaps, that CFPB look at what ways in which RE-driven analyses could produce insights that inform policy and regulatory issues that the CFPB is currently wrestling with. And the compliance assistance sandboxes, the no action letters, for example, with Upstart. I think it's very interesting that with that no action letter for Upstart, CFPB is looking at ways in which artificial intelligence might not just streamline underwriting, but perhaps remove some bias, or maybe not. We don't really know, but that might be an important thing to focus on, is if there's any way for regulatory innovation that CFPB is currently involved in to assess, does it have a positive or negative effect with respect to REE. Yeah, so those are, I think, a couple of considerations.
So not seeing any hands up at the moment, I'm gonna, let me throw out one question that's implied by a couple of these bullets and ask for examples of work that folks are seeing done that we might learn a lot from. Vicky mentioned the oversample by race and ethnicity that I understand they're doing at the SCF. Other examples of research or data sources you've seen developed that might be good examples for us or might be good resources for us. in focusing on this work. Vicky's hand up.
Vicky has, yeah, there you go.
So I was just actually, this is more of a question back to you. I mean, part of the executive order, I think it was section 9, really identified this kind of establishing, data sets that are, identified, have racial identifiers. And they mention that many of the federal data sets are not disaggregated by race. Is there a central sort of source of information where you can actually see what are the data sets that are, currently being developed and which ones have been earmarked, like the SCF, to provide more disaggregated information? Because it seems like as part of the executive order, there was a section specifically identified to address issues with respect to federal data.
That's a good question. Tavi may have something to say here, but I'm not familiar with the central repository. The Bureau itself has published a data catalog of the data resources that we have here in the Bureau. Generally, my impression is that race and ethnicity are available in survey data sources and generally not in administrative data sources, setting HMDA aside. And so for a lot of the administrative data sources that we use, that's where we have a gap, whereas being able to do surveys off of our consumer credit panel has been great from the perspective of being able to say something about race and ethnicity and other demographic factors that we can get by asking the individual directly. The downside we've seen to some degree is that the sample size is just much smaller on our survey data. So while in our work using Making Ends Meet, we've been able to identify differences in average, say, financial well-being, and in a static sense, we were able to say, okay, we can see that African Americans' financial well-being is significantly less than that of white Americans, for example. In looking at how did the pandemic affect the different groups? Did it affect different groups differentially? We just haven't had the sample size to really identify whether that's happened. And that's something where, maybe we can cure that through larger samples. Maybe we can cure that through oversampling to a greater degree. But those are some of the trade-offs we see. And I think, as you mentioned, the executive order and other efforts around the government may help develop resources on multiple fronts.
Yeah.
So
I mean, it might be a nice idea to really understand, as a result of this executive order, which places like the SCF are going to be doing the oversampling that could lead to you being able to answer some of the big questions that you have with regard to the rulemaking process.
That's a great point. And it's probably really important for us to understand what's going on around the government. Matthew has his hand up.
Yeah, I was thinking, I was thinking about your question, and again, it just makes me think, just taking some time to look at what Brandeis has been doing over several years and really unpacking the racial wealth gap, for example, Tom Shapiro and that group, Jacob Faber at NYU, Derek Hamilton at Ohio State, of course there are others. But also in terms of what data sets are they using, how are they operationalizing different variables, what kind of conceptual framework is it presented in? But also I think I struggle with how to respond to the question, because keep coming back to, well, what's the research question? You know, what specific lines of inquiry are you proposing? And I don't know if that's known yet, or if that's something that you all are developing.
Well, I'll say that is probably best described as something we're developing. I think we're, Tavi and I are coming at this more specifically from the context of looking at the impacts of the Bureau's rulemaking, and what those rules are going to be are things that we may not know yet, and will necessarily, the Bureau has authorities in different credit markets, and as the Bureau moves forward, I'm sure policy priorities will change over time, and so the types of questions we'll be looking at are probably going to continue to evolve. Right. Tony's hand is up.
Well, just a shot in the dark. I mean, the group that does the most to characterize the welfare of different groups is probably the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And so you'd certainly want to maybe consult with some of the economists over there. They're very pleasant, and they will be back in the office pretty soon. So you could, maybe consult with them, and they're probably going to have to respond to this executive order some way. And obviously, they do have some advantage in some of their data sets, like personal consumption expenditure surveys. But you might learn something from them. Let me make one other point, and that was a while back there was some talk of promoting an index of financial distress using your what's it, FY14 or what it is, data. And I think that would be a neat idea. You might be able to, get some sort of disaggregation by demographic characteristics, again, based on location or some other indications in the data. But I really think that index numbers are really, really valuable to track how we're doing and what's happening, and whether what's happening is extraordinary or not. So if I'd urge you to reconsider, or if you drop that, to establish it again. And actually, index numbers are something I know about. So if you want to, you can contact me if you want some advice about constructing an index number using some of the modern multidimensional techniques that give you a pretty good measure of what might be going on. So anyway, that's sort of two ideas.
Thanks very much. And I see Vicky's hand is up, camera's on, and maybe this isn't her role as timekeeper, since I think we're at time.
Yes, I did want to exercise my role as timekeeper and be respectful of everybody's time and make sure that I give Manny a few moments. Did you have any last remarks, Eric, that you wanted to say?
Just to say thank you to all the members of the ARC. You've given us a lot to think about and to work on. I'm sure we'll be coming back to you over the next year to talk more about these issues.
I'll echo that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for kind of a great presentation. And so I actually would like to thank everybody for a great afternoon filled with your perspectives on these important topics. We're at time now. I did want to say briefly that I was really struck by the rich discussion during today's meeting and the insightfulness of the comments made by my fellow ARC members. And so with that, I'd like to adjourn today's call, and I hope you all stay safe during this time. And Manny, I'll turn the call back over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Vicky, for moderating, and obviously thank ARC members for providing such good feedback to the Bureau, and for Bureau staff for making time and presenting during this week's advisory committees and today during this ARC meeting. So with that, thanks again for joining us today. And Tracy, we may disconnect at this time. Thank you, folks. Happy Friday.